Welcome everybody to the 12th annual Peter Barcham Memorial Lecture. We call it an annual lecture. In fact, the last one was almost 21 months ago. And you know the reason why, with all these restrictions, postponements and the rest. I've got here the flyer for the last lecture. Some of you would have been here to hear Bronwyn Pike of Uniting Victoria, Tasmania. So here we are for the 12th in this series. We've had a great variety of speakers over the years since we started in 2010 with these lectures, both Christian and Jewish speakers, male and female, great variety of topics, and not all Uniting Church speakers, not only Jewish but other Christian denominations. It's a great pleasure to me personally to welcome my good friend Reverend Dr. Peter Blackwood to be our lecturer for today. I'll introduce Peter in a few moments, but just a couple of other things to say before I do that. Peter is very happy to deal with questions after his address. His lecture, he tells me, is not very long, so there should be plenty of time for questions and comment. After all of that, there will be a simple afternoon tea served over in the corner here. In this church we often have very elaborate suppers and afternoon teas, but that's not for today. With the requirements of distancing and the handling of food and so forth, we have just tea, coffee and biscuits, and we ask you to be careful about distancing. There's also an opportunity during that time for you to talk with Peter, if you'd like to, about his talk and about the icons, which you can see displayed here on these two tables. So, Peter Barcham died in the year 2008. Most of you here, I think, knew him, but I expect not everybody did. I'll say a few words about Peter. Peter Barcham was a significant figure in this church and in the Gisborne community and beyond that. So in recognition of his great contribution, this congregation decided to institute these lectures as a memorial to him. Peter was a mathematician and a teacher. He was principal of the Gisborne High School, which is now called the Gisborne Secondary College. In recognition of his years of service there, the school hall, when it was rebuilt, was renamed the Peter Barcham Theatre. Polymaths like Peter are rather rare. He was a great reader. A favourite topic of his was the history of the early Christian church, and he read widely in the history and criticism of the New Testament. Some of his books from his large library are to be used here in our local church library. This reading that he did informed both sermons and lectures that he gave in this church from time to time. But Peter was more than an intellectual person. He contributed to this community in other ways. He hosted musical afternoons at his home, and he cared for people in need, for example, driving people to their medical appointments. He was concerned for the welfare of the whole Macedon Rangers community. For some years, Peter was president of the local Probus Club. He also worked with his hands, and a collection of his model boats is displayed in the South Australian town of Morgan. Peter left us not only physical things, like his books, but he left us the example of a generous and questioning mind. Also, the gift of friendship and a good humour. As I said, Peter died in the year 2008. I believe these memorial lectures have continued to do what he did, which was to inform, to inspire, and to encourage honest debate. So, we come now to today's lecture, and I'd like to introduce to you Peter Blackwood. Peter is a retired minister of the Uniting Church. He has served parishes across Victoria for a period of 25 years, and he's also served at regional level at Presbytery. Which Presbytery is that here?
Oh, golly, Maroondah and then Yarra Yarra.
Right, 2 presbyteries. And he was also on the staff of the Synod in Melbourne. Prior to ordination, Peter was a teacher for 9 years. He's also a keen amateur musician, being chorister in 2 Melbourne choirs and also a violinist. His interest in music, scripture and worship combined together when he undertook research for his doctorate. His doctorate is on the Old Testament Psalms. Peter has been painting icons for 18 years, and I'm the proud owner of one of his beautiful icons. He's given many lectures about icons and has been coordinator of the Melbourne Icon Schools on behalf of the Uniting Church for, I left a blank here, how many years?
Since 2013.
2013, so we're up to 8 years as coordinator. So I should add, I know this is not in my notes, but I should add that Peter is quite a modest man, because when I asked him to give me on the email some biographical information about himself, he only gave me about 20 or 25 words. So I had to elaborate on that. Peter, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and I hand over to you to deliver your lecture, which you can see there on the wall, Eastern Orthodox Icons Observed by a Western Iconographer.
Thank you, Darcy, and I was interested to see a photo of your icon on the promotion.
That's right.
Whenever I think of that icon, whenever I hear Lakmé's, the opera Lakmé, I remember painting that icon because I was doing the carpet area on a Saturday afternoon listening to Lakmé. These associations of music and art, and they just all come together. And it is just a delight, and thank you for this invitation to deliver this year's Peter Barcham Memorial Lecture. It is a huge privilege and a great joy, a privilege to be part of an event that honours a saint from among you, and a joy because, well, I just love talking about iconography. It's nearly as much fun as painting icons. I have chosen to address the topic in 3 parts. Firstly, to tell my own story of engagement with icons. Secondly, to tell some of the history of icons and how to read them, what's going on when we look at this, for many of us, strange art form. And thirdly, to explain how icons are painted. And if there's anything that I haven't covered that you would really like to hear about, there'll be time for questions later. Just a little aside, many people in some traditions will say that I should be talking about writing icons rather than painting them. And this is a convention that is under debate at present. For painting is not less honourable than writing for expressing holy truths. Some leading world iconographers in a Zoom debate that I watched recently heavily in favour of painting rather than writing icons. And it also, this idea of writing seems to be a Western idea, and an English one at that, rather than Eastern Orthodoxy. Yes, we do claim, we in the iconography world, that icons are special, that they're a special art form. It's special in the church not only because it is religious art, reminds us of the gospel, reminds us of our salvation, but it has a special place in the life of the church because it is liturgical art. It belongs within the church's life of prayer. So this is why I normally speak of painting icons. I do lapse sometimes. So, my story. I'm actually not quite sure where it started. Not sure what first attracted me to this, for a Protestant, for a very Calvin-centred Protestant, this strange art form. My grandfather would be appalled, and he was a minister too. I do remember buying a book by Søren Næss, a Norwegian iconographer, who published a book called The Mystical Language of Icons. It included a blow-by-blow description of how to paint an icon of Christ. Now, there are two pronunciations for this, Pantocrator or Pantocrator. The English tend to say Pantocrator, but when I'm amongst Greeks and Russians, Pantocrator is favoured. And also there was how to paint Mary and how to paint John the Baptist, so I gave it a go. Not with the traditional forms of using egg tempera, but bought some very basic tubes of acrylic paint and a couple of canvas boards and had a go. They're buried somewhere in cupboards and drawers in my study, but I have kept them. I was aware of Robert Gallagher and that he had started an icon school at Otira in Kew. And it was at a minister's retreat that I first saw one of the members of that school, Ken Gilson, working on his latest icon, painting on a gessoed panel, mixing dry pigment with egg yolk. And so in 2003, I joined the monthly Saturday class in Kew. It took me a year to paint my first icon of Christ Pantocrator. Most of these icons took about a day. I'm getting the hang of it. And 10 years later, I was invited by Rob to help him in the running of the icon schools. By now there were 3, one on Saturday, one on Monday, one on Wednesday, 3 separate groups working in different churches, but now they all meet at the same church in Oxley Road in Hawthorne. But he was wanting some help and wanting to phase out of this particular activity to give time to other things. And so these tasks that he was asking me to help with included leading learning sessions. So each time we meet, we have a learning session of about half an hour. We have a worship session as well after lunch. So, would I help with the learning session? Would I help with the worship? Would I do the administration? Now, I'd spent 4 years as a church bureaucrat, as Darcy has pointed out, and 30 years of leading worship. So those 2 jobs they were okay. I felt quite confident about them. The problem was that I had only painted about 50 icons at that stage, and I knew that in the Greek Orthodox tradition, you're not allowed to teach iconography until you've painted 200 icons. And so who was I with this lack of experience to dare to teach this craft? And also, all my instruction had been from others in the class and books and a few videos. There were some very talented, Rob was very experienced, some other very talented artists. One just painted these most extraordinarily beautiful icons. I just love watching her painting the faces. She would start with the faces because she wanted to be able to relate to this icon's face while she dressed the saint and did all the other things. And she would put these strokes of colour right across, and then she would start to do the details, and these beautiful faces would emerge. Dear Rita, she died of cancer some years ago, but we still have and love and treasure her icons. Well, I realised I needed a lot more experience. I needed to be painting icons. And one of the tricky things about icon painting is choosing what the next one will be. So I embarked on a project to paint the saints and the heroes of faith that are set out in the Uniting Church's calendar of other commemorations. There are about nearly 120 of those, so I thought, well, there's plenty to be going on with. And so the calendar chose the art for me. And so I decided on a particular size, a particular format, and I'm now about 8 icons away from finishing. I'm really looking forward to finishing, partly so that I can have adventures in other formats. So that's what I've been doing over these years. It was painting these saints. There are a lot stacked away carefully in boxes, but in our living room there are, I think, about 70 that peer down at us. The next job was to find a teacher. Philip Davidov and his wife Olga Shalamova are Russian artists and iconographers who live in St. Petersburg. And they teach their craft in Russia, in the USA, in Canada, in Italy. Philip's amazing. I mean, his English is fantastic, his Russian isn't bad, and he teaches in Italian as well. And New Zealand, they speak English there. And each January, provided there is no world pandemic, they spend 3 weeks in Melbourne teaching at the Australian Catholic University. They've exhibited in Moscow, in Washington DC, and in Melbourne. And so I've attended about 5 or 6 years worth of their workshops. Each year they provide courses in particular aspects of icons. So one year you'll go along and learn about a couple of different ways of painting faces. Another time it'll be hands and feet, clothing, drapery, full-length figures. And they've changed my life. Perhaps the most noted iconographer in the UK is Aidan Hart, and you'll hear more about him later too. And he's written of Philip and Olga. An easy option for the iconographer is to copy past masterpieces, like a scribe duplicating a text. But is this the fullest expression of the Church's tradition? A word which does after all mean to hand on what has been received. Philip and Olga have chosen the more difficult path, but I believe the more traditional. By expressing the faith with their own unique style, they use the recognisable language of icons, but give it their own emphasis and strive to distill the essence of their sacred subjects. They experiment with degrees of elongation, the currents and eddies of the figure's drapery, manifest the dynamics of the sacred event. So their influence, Philip and Olga's influence on me has been profound, and we've become firm friends. The first change I learned was to paint at an easel standing up rather than being hunched over my work at a desk. The second was to use good tools. Brushes of natural hair like Kolinsky and Squirrel. Much better control. And you can load one of those brushes and wipe it off 20 times and it will still have enough belly in it to keep going and not have to be refilled too quickly. My students now, because most of us start with Teclon brushes, which is an artificial hair, and when I see a student using one of these, try this, and to see their face light up as they experience the difference of a good brush. When Sue and I were in Russia, Philip was very emphatic that we go and buy some Russian brushes. They're the best in the world. We went into a shop in Moscow and well, do you want the Rublev ones or the what were the other ones? Anyway, they were German. Wouldn't dare. But no, their brushes are beautiful. Well, the next exciting venture with icons has been the overseas travel that Sue and I have been able to do in retirement. Whatever city we visit, we usually explore the art galleries and find the icon section. We have a son living out of Detroit, who's an engineer with a motor company, and so the galleries in Detroit and Chicago and New York, Washington DC have some fantastic icons. But in Italy, we visited Ravenna and we spent days walking from church to baptistry to chapel, all lined with wall to ceiling mosaics. Mosaics were the main feature of iconography in Istanbul as well, in Hagia Sophia and the Kora Monastery. So icons are not only painted, but they are, many of them, well, they survive so well when they're mosaics. And some also painted not with egg tempera, but with melted wax. Some of the we'll see some of the very early ones painted like that. In Greece, we visited ancient churches in Mistra. Any minute now, that's going to go across to where I wanted to go. This Mistra is the mountains above Sparta, and we were taken by the bus up the top and walked down these tracks through all these different buildings and through churches and monasteries where the frescoes still survive. The frescoes on these painted walls, they're painted with, very often egg tempera, but painted onto the surface while it's still wet. So they've got to work very quickly. I've seen a bit of film of George Cordis, and he's a professor of iconography in Athens, and he gets commissions all over the world. And he was painting a church in America, and he was doing the Pantocrator on the dome, and he was high up on this on trestles, and he had a looked like a longish billiard cue with a bit of not a pencil, but charcoal attached to the end, and he's just drawing the thing right up in the sky just to get the outline. And these frescoes are just amazing how they, and they're still doing them. It's still an art form. I haven't learned that one yet. We also went to Meteori and the monasteries perched up on crags of rock. How they built them, apart from painting the beautiful frescoes in them. In St. Petersburg, we spent a wonderful afternoon with Philip and Olga, and we visited, amongst other things, we visited their church, and it has a modern fresco. Those of you who might be familiar with Eastern Orthodox Church, this is very different because it doesn't have an Iconostasis, or as they will pronounce it, Iconostasis, the screen that the icons are on. This is the lower church, and this is fresco, just beautifully painted. They're very sensible in Russia. They have two churches. Any church has two churches. They have a downstairs one, warmer for winter, and then there's upstairs, bigger and grander, but they only go there in summer because it's so cold. But upstairs, we saw this reconstructed Iconostasis. This church is the Fyodorovsky Cathedral. It was built to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. So it was the church that Nicholas II and the family attended. It was their St. Petersburg church. And this special gold-encrusted thing, because they stand, you don't sit in a Russian service, you stand. You might go outside for a smoke every so often because they're very long services, but there was a special thing for the Tsar to stand in. But they had reconstructed this church. 80% of the Russian churches were destroyed during the 70-year Soviet era, and now they're rebuilding them. And this one is extraordinary. It was a mess. It was commandeered and made into a milk factory, and then it fell into a very sorry state, and now they've rebuilt it. We took a journey along the Russian waterways from St. Petersburg to Moscow. On the way, visiting different places, including this little island of Ziki. And there was a couple of churches and chapels, and in it this wonderful Iconostasis, and also a number of monks who sang to us, just beautiful. On this trip to Russia, perhaps the most exciting venture was a visit to the Tetyakov Gallery in Moscow. It was early on a Sunday morning. Our tour guide had done her thing and released us to go and explore. We headed for the Icon Gallery. No one else was interested in icons, thank goodness. We had it all to ourselves and saw the most famous of all icons. I've spoken with friends who have visited the gallery and have seen this icon amidst crowds of people, or at times before the selfie was invented and you weren't able to take photographs at all. We had this icon to ourselves for 20 minutes, so I've got a thorough going over with my camera. And I've looked at this, I've painted it 3 times, and there were just things that you see in the flesh or in the egg, in the pigment, that you just don't see in the photographs. I didn't realise that there were these fine gold lines around the wings. Because this icon was, it's been restored, it's been cleaned. When it was, I don't know when they were cleaning it. They had a silver covering on it, and that mucked it up. And the bits that you could see would be the faces and the hands. They were black from the darkening, not only of soot from candles and things like that, but from the oil that had been used to varnish it. That's all cleaned off, and this beautiful result can still be seen. This was painted in 1425 by Andrei Rublev and became the pattern. A council in Moscow said, no, from here on in, if you're going to paint the Holy Trinity, that's the model. That's what it's going to look like. Well, there have been other adventures, but anyway, how might we read our icons? Understanding icons is helped by reflecting on some perceptions and some history. Here are two views, firstly of a Protestant, Robert Leatham, who writes, Eastern Orthodoxy is increasingly popular in the Anglo-Saxon world. It conveys a sense of mystery, a continuity with the past, of dignified worship when some churches are becoming less formal. And then an Eastern Orthodox Christian, Andreas Andriopoulos, writes, liturgical practices in the Christian East have always been associated with a kind of sensory richness that many Westerners find difficult to understand. Many Western Christians find a plain church environment conducive to prayer and reflection on the biblical message. But when they enter a candlelit, fragrant Byzantine church, the walls which are completely covered with icons, they often find the sensory overload distracting from what is more familiar to them, namely a religious environment that is centred essentially on the written and spoken word. So those of us of the Protestant tradition, yes, we understand what he's saying. Images that we now recognise as belonging to the tradition of icons go way, way back. They were evident in the early centuries of the church, in the catacombs as part of the grave art amongst some of the earlier survivors, and of course they're carved. Perhaps the most notorious icons up to the first 600 years are in St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. Now, this is where the burning bush was supposed to have been, and of course there was within the courtyard a bush which is supposed to have been related to that burning bush, and someone has put a fire extinguisher to the side. I've been told that, I don't know how true it is. But these icons, I was mentioning before that some icons are painted not with their tempera but with melted wax, and that's how these were painted. Incidentally, when we were with Philip and Olga in their church, we went up and up and up and up, room after room. We passed a group doing some crafts. We did past another one working on embroidery on their vestments, and up the top was an iconographer painting the Empress Alexandra with wax, and it's called encaustic. And Philip is having a go now too. He's painting some extraordinary icons straight onto panel without preparation, just with the raw pigments and melted wax. Now, these icons are significant because they survived the mass destruction of icons when the church legislated that icons transgressed the commandment against images. And this is known as the Iconoclastic Controversy. The reasoning behind the Iconoclastic Controversy is well expressed by John of Damascus. Now, he was for icons, but here he is using the rhetoric of, well, we'll put up the argument that we're going to argue against. But he does express, I think, pretty persuasively, and many of us Protestants will resonate with it, when he says, how can the invisible be depicted? How does one picture the inconceivable? How can one draw what is limitless, immeasurable, infinite? How can a form be given to the formless? How does one paint the bodiless? How can you describe what is a mystery? But in response, John of Damascus went on to say, I have seen God in human form, and my soul was saved. In former times, God, who is without form or body, could never be depicted. But now when God is seen in the flesh conversing with humans, I make an image of the God whom I see. I do not worship matter. I worship the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake, who willed to take his abode in matter, who worked out my salvation through matter. And this is very reflective of the beginning of John's Gospel. The Word was in the beginning, and the Word became flesh. Elsewhere, the scriptures talk about Jesus being the image of the invisible God. So Christ himself is an icon, is what these early Christians were arguing, particularly at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 in the Common Era. And it made its ruling on icons in the church and set the parameters. So next to the sign of the precious and life-giving cross may be icons of our Lord and God the Saviour Jesus Christ, of our pure Lady the Holy Theotokos, and of honourable angels and of any saint. The council was clear about the status of icons in the life of the church. They were for their veneration and not to be objects of worship in themselves. Furthermore, it's the formal declaration, the Nicene Creed goes on to, not the Creed, I suppose the press releases that came out of the Council of Nicaea say, for the more these are kept in view through their iconographic representation, the more those who look at them are lifted up to remember and have an earnest desire for the prototypes. Now what they mean by the prototypes is the saint. The saint in heaven is the prototype. What is painted is not what is worshipped. That's not the saint. Also we declare that one may render to them the veneration of honour, not the true worship of our faith which is due only to the divine nature, but the same kind of veneration as is offered to the form of the precious and life-giving cross, the holy gospels, and to other holy items. Also we declare that one may honour these by bringing to them incense and light, as was the pious custom of the early Christians, for the honour to the icon is conveyed to the prototype. Now, I mentioned that particularly in a Western context, because many in the West are worried about what happens in Eastern churches and the way in which people are relating to these objects, to these icons. Now, not only were they saying it back then, to be very clear, these are holy objects, but not to be worshipped. Now, they're still saying that very strongly. Controversy continued, but was finally put to rest by the Synod of Constantinople. In celebration on the 11th of March 843, a grand procession restored the icons in Hagia Sophia, that's in Istanbul. It's celebrated annually on the first Sunday of Lent as the triumph of orthodoxy. Now, after the iconoclastic period, there were changes. There were more prescriptions imposed that still apply to modern icons, at least in Europe. They don't seem to apply so much in Africa, that is, in Coptic and Ethiopian icons. An icon in Greek, Russian and other Eastern Bloc churches will have an inscription label to tell us who the image is. It's the difference between that Eastern art and Western art. In Western art we put the name of the painting on the back and the name of the artist on the front. In icons we do it the other way around. Christ has an abbreviated label in Greek and in Cyrillic. Cyrillic is the text that's the fonts used in Russian. These texts look similar and are simply Jesu Christos, Jesus Christ. We know it's been abbreviated by the wavy line above each word. Those familiar with Greek will say, well, that doesn't look like a sigma, and that's because they use an old form of the sigma, which looks more like our C. Except for icons of resurrection, of the ascension, of the transfiguration, of the baptism of Jesus, Jesus will normally wear two garments of different colours. And these are to remind the worshipper of the two natures of Christ, human and divine. The right hand of Christ and of many of the saints will hold a posture of blessing. You'll notice there's on some of these, if you look at them later on. So the 5 digits will be grouped in some way, sometimes in anatomically impossible ways, to remind the worshipper of the two natures of Christ and of the Holy Trinity. So they'll be grouped in 2 and 3. There are some groupings used by priests in the Eastern Church and depicted in icons to simulate this abbreviation of Jesu Christos. So getting the I and the C shape and the chi and that C shape with the one hand. I have to say arthritis prevents me from demonstrating this quite how this is done. A saint and Christ will always have a halo. And unlike some halos, particularly in Western art, the iconic halo will surround the head with the centre of the circle at the level of the eyebrows. Now, in most iconography, the eyes are halfway up the head. And so the number of times that we're working out, okay, how are we going to do this circle? The centre will be about there, and not to the centre of the nose, but to the side. Because in nearly every icon, even though it's looking straight onto you, the centre of the head is not the centre of the face. It is ever so slightly moved to the side. All those wonderful little traditions. Christ's halo will have a cross inscribed within it, with either a decoration or with the letters O and it's Omicron, no, yes, Omicron, Omega and Nu. So it's Ho-On, which literally translates as the living one. Sometimes in an English icon it'll be rendered as I am. Saints are never depicted in profile. We always see two eyes. The Coptic priest was explaining to us that a figure showing one eye is a malevolent person. And so it's not uncommon, particularly in Coptic iconography, for Judas to appear in the Last Supper in profile, and without a halo. Figures in icons are not smiling. There's a serious contemplation going on. Mouths tend to be small, there is more hearing and seeing than speaking. Incidentally, this became a tradition in Western portraiture as well, that while there might be a hint of a smile, Mona Lisa, we don't see teeth. I suspect it's because actually teeth are really hard to paint. I've heard Ando also say this, and he does sometimes paint teeth on his portraits, but I've heard him say that it can be a bit unnerving to have a grinning portrait. We do it in photographs, but not in painted portraits. This is an example of an icon I painted for the front cover of a devotional periodical, With Love to the World. And it illustrates some of my attempts at symbolism. You can see it live over here. Let me help us to read this icon. The patterns in the frame include an upside-down cross. The tradition has it that Peter was crucified upside down. That's why, incidentally, I've also followed Olga. Olga is a wonderful designer, and her borders are just fantastic. I mean, she will do those kinds of designs in the border, but with gesso. So this is the whiting that's put on top of the before the painting is started, and she will paint the design with gesso, so it's raised up. So it'll do 3 or 4 coats of this, sometimes very intricate. I haven't tried that. Some of my students have with great success, but I've still got to learn that. But I was imitating some of her when I did this, so that in this cross there is also, Peter was a fisherman, so you can see the net structure in part of that. Also part of the story of Pentecost is of the flames that rested on the disciples' head. So the flames are also outlined in that design. Peter is standing on a pavement made up of portions of the text on the scroll translated into different languages. And this feature is remembering that every language group in the crowd heard the apostles in their own language. So 5 languages from a selection of ethnic congregations in the Uniting Church were chosen for this, and colleagues helped me with this. So I asked them to translate the beginning of the scroll that's in Peter's hand. And so, Darcy, I hope you'll recognise the Tongan. There's Chinese as well, Indonesian, Korean and Tamil. And the 6th is the Garawa language, First Peoples of Australia, from lands towards the Gulf of Carpentaria. Many of the great icons of the world can be seen in galleries and museums, but they rightly belong in churches and homes. Their proper place is where people pray. It is unfortunate that we see the great traditional famous icons not in churches but in galleries. But there are still some very fine examples in churches, of course. And here is one in Greece. In Orthodox churches, there is the screen separating the nave from the apse and the altar. There are vestiges of this in Western churches as well. But in the East, the screen is called the icon screen, or the Iconostasis. It has 3 doors. Only the priest can use the centre one, called the royal doors, often decorated with icons, sometimes of Basil the Great and John Chrysostom. This example doesn't have them. I think what the 4 lowest icons in the royal doors are the 4 gospel writers. But up towards the top there are 2 icons, and one is of Gabriel and the other is of Mary. So it's the Annunciation. To the right, to our right of the royal doors, will be an icon of Christ Pantocrator, meaning ruler of all. The Christ Pantocrator is the most used icon in Eastern churches, so they'll be on the Iconostasis, very often in the dome or at the door as you go in. To the left will be Mary, the Virgin Theotokos, God-bearer, carrying her son. There will usually also be, probably the other side of Christ, John the Baptist, and John the Baptist will be in a posture indicating that he's the forerunner, and he's making a gesture with his hands towards the one who is coming. Often directly above the royal doors will be an icon of the Last Supper. I'm not speaking very much about icons of stories in the Bible. There are many. I mean, it's very popular. I just happen to have been doing most of my work with saints, so that's what I'm talking mostly about. And above that, there'll also probably be an icon of the saint after whom the church is named. So we were in Crete and went to the church of St. Titus. Titus was the first bishop of Crete, and there are quite a few icons of Titus there. Not only icons of Titus, but in the side chapel, his skull. It's in a gold dome. You don't really see the bone bits, but it's him. And usually towards the flanks there'll be a couple of archangels as well. Right up top there may be an icon of the Trinity. And so to return to the Fedorovsky Cathedral in St. Petersburg, there are about 100 icons in this Iconostasis. The screen itself has been remade completely, and it is intricately carved. There are many icons. Oh, this incidentally was the model that they worked from, and it's painted by Olga. It's huge, and she painted the whole thing. And there's still some of them. I think some of the gaps are filled with photographs, so they're still painting the icons to complete this iconostasis. Many Russian churches are turning away from gold, and this is one of them, because of its connotations of wealth and power and privilege. They don't want their churches to resemble restored imperial buildings of the city, and so confuse divine power with civic power. I'd heard Philip talk about this in Melbourne. I got it when we were in St. Petersburg, because you go to the great restored palaces and they're just screaming with gold. I mean, they're beautiful. But then you go to a church and it's the same idea, and I thought, oh, that's what he's talking about. This isn't what the power of God is about. The church is different. And this little screen doesn't have any gold because the village would have been too poor. But homes are also the places for icons. These were two icons in the B&B where we stayed in Venice. And here are two. This is, I mean, look, the frame is so ornate, but this is in a poor restored, a village, but it would have been a poor village. And it's high up, out of the reach of the children and the animals. Another one, again, sort of venerated with drapery. one of the delights, and I particularly asked if we could visit Philip and Olga's studio. And these are Celtic saints painted by Olga. I think you can see the design in those edges. The inscriptions are in English, so she's obviously working these for an English market. Also, there were these two that are painted by Philip, and these are now in a small country church outside St. Petersburg. Incidentally, their studio is granted to them because they are professional artists, professionally registered artists in Russia. And it is an old Soviet-era apartment, no longer suitable for living quarters. So it was really interesting to go into their studio, which was, was what people used to live in during the Soviet era. We can recognise different styles of icons, recognise different schools. For example, if the background is red, it was probably painted in Novgorod. There were different traditions for what represented heaven. So sometimes it would be gold, sometimes it would be red, and sometimes it would be blue. So here are 4 icons of the same subject, of the Annunciation. The first one by Aidan Hart, English taught, but he was taught in a Greek monastery. He has converted to Greek Orthodoxy. Philip Davidov's is the second one, and of course, as I've been explaining, he's a modern Russian. The third is a Coptic style developed in recent years. It was actually developed in Paris by a number of iconographers who were influenced by the Impressionists, and they were concerned that the traditional Coptic icons and the traditional one, traditionally their figures are short, eyes are large, they're readily recognisable as a particular style. But in recent years, the influence of Western art has, in their terms, was contaminating. It was making it look more Western, more sentimental. And so they developed this new Coptic style, and that's gone back into Cairo. Rob Gallagher met one of them painting the cathedral in Cairo, and he has also painted Coptic churches here in Melbourne, and he lives in Melbourne. So we're closely associated with this tradition, and the painting of the Darcy's icon is in this style. I really like it. Also, incidentally, you can see that red drapery behind, because in many icons there'll be, particularly of scenes where there'll be red drapery, and that will indicate that above the drapery is heaven and below is the earthly place. Can you paint in an Australian style? These are Lois Brunt, one of our members, very gifted artist. Now that doesn't look like an icon, and yet she has obeyed about every tradition in iconography. So obviously Australian, but if you can read an icon, so obviously iconographic as well. Just love the way she's got the feathers of Gabriel, looking like a cockatoo's crest. Incidentally, you'll have noticed that Gabriel always enters that way. I've only seen 2 images, one in Italy and one in America, of Gabriel entering from the wrong side. I was appalled. Here is a really honest attempt at an Australian icon using pigments from the Kimberley, using some Aboriginal art motifs, but also notice that Gabriel is Asian. But of the Australian icons, this is my favourite. Our Lady of the Central West, the Diocese of Ballarat, says this of this icon. The newly commissioned icon was unveiled and blessed as part of the closing celebrations of the sesquicentenary of the diocese on the 30th of October 2016, entitled Our Lady of the Central West. The icon shows Mary praying with us and for us. Bathurst-based iconographer Mary Clancy painted the icon, which she crafted with earth pigments, the colour coming from across Europe, the Middle East and Australia, representing the soil on many of the homelands from which the people of the Diocese of Bathurst originate. Gold highlights are included, as gold plays a pivotal role in our region's past and present. The border incorporates the totems of the local Wiradjuri and Gamilara nations. The 4 concentric circles at the top represent the Cathedral of St Michael and St John. 16 triple concentric circles represent the parish churches, and 37 others represent small Eucharistic communities. These are joined by a wandering line of dots, the pathways which connect all of these groups together. Beautifully thought out icon. The icon was commissioned by Bishop Michael McKenna to mark the sesquicentenary. He dared to call this the Lady of the Central West because before he was ordained a bishop, he went to the Tarrawarra Abbey in the Dandenongs, and there they have an icon of Our Lady of Tarrawarra. And he's saying to the abbot, how come you can do, how come you were able to just name it Our Lady of Tarrawarra? He says, oh, well, you can. I said, oh, okay, well, I will. So that's what he's done. I have painted with Mary, and I know from my conversation with her that the local elders helped in the design of the totems and gave permission for their use. This icon has integrity as an Australian icon. I think it's wonderful. I'm going hopelessly over time. Do you want a breather? Let me say very quickly a few things about how I paint icons. I'll be very brief. We start with a panel, usually timber. This is pine from the friendly Bunnings store. I have routed out this inside part. It's called kivatos in Greek and kovchek in Russian. It means ark. It's for protecting the icon. And that is then covered with linen, and it's glued on with rabbit skin glue. It's a dried flake, and it's soaked for 3 hours. 1 part rabbit skin glue to 13 to 15 parts of water, soaked for 3 hours, heated to less than 50 degrees. If it goes more, it starts to cook and loses its stickability, and it is smoothed on, so it's absolutely solid bit of. And then whiting, chalk whiting, is added to that glue. So 1 part of the glue to up to 1.5 times of whiting, stirred, and painted on coat after coat after coat, 7 to 10 coats, and then sanded back smooth. So feel free to come and look at these and feel them. You don't have to worry about social distancing with these. They haven't been vaccinated, but they don't need. The paint is dry pigment. Some of it ochre, some of it chemically based, and it is mixed with egg tempera. And egg tempera is egg yolk, 1 part egg yolk, 1 part white wine, or water if you're going to use it. But I could keep it for months in the fridge, and having it in white wine keeps really well and smells much better. I think probably what I'll do is I have there's a little video which only runs very quickly, and I'll play it while we're having tea rather than take the time now. But what you see in that is the building up slowly of the icon. It's 20 times. It's going at 20 times normal speed, so it's over in a flash. But you can basically we're starting by sketching straight onto the panel with ochre and water, and then progressively adding the egg, other colours, getting the shading in, building up to the base colour, adding titanium white progressively to get the highlights working, and so that's all stuff that I've learned from Philip and Olga. I haven't touched on gilding. That's another whole area, perhaps for another day. But you may have questions you need to ask.
Please direct your questions straight to Peter.
Can I ask one?
The hand up there was first.
I just wonder, is using the egg yolk, what's the purpose for that? Is it ageability or what? Why?
Oh, it's the artists used all sorts of materials for painting, and egg tempera was popular right up to the time of the Renaissance. And so, I've forgotten which of the great artists. Was it Michelangelo or was it? It was Da Vinci who discovered that oil works much better, it's glossier, and got more control. But no, egg tempera as for painting in other bits of the art world apart from iconography, egg tempera is being tried again. Yes.
Just a quick question about the icon. As far as the dimensional side of it, are they always just the two-dimensional, no depth painted into them?
Yes. In our Saturday class we have a Greek woman, and I forgot what we were talking about the other day, but she was adamant it must be two-dimensional, never three-dimensional. And she was very strong on that. And yes, always two-dimensional. I mean, there are carvings. Aidan Hart is a polymath as far as iconography goes, and he's written a definitive book on the whole subject. So he carves in timber, he does mosaic, and he paints in unique timber. Yes.
I'm just wondering how you make sober-looking gentlemen saints from the 20th century. How do you make them look glorious?
Yes, I didn't. It's very tricky making, painting people that people recognise. I recently painted Helen Mackenzie, who was a wonderful medical doctor to Korea. I knew her personally. She always smiled, and there was a photo. I couldn't find a photo of her without a smile, so I did have to close the mouth. And it does look like Helen. But Philip would argue with me. Now, when I was mentioning that iconographer painting in wax up on the top of that cathedral, and Philip and he were having this agitated conversation. And my Russian doesn't go past thank you and good morning. So he had to translate for me. He says, he's painting the Tsarina so that it looks like a photo. And I'm saying he shouldn't do that. Why are you doing that? And he's saying because people know what she looks like. It'll need to look, they'll need to be able to recognise her. And I'm saying, but how do you not do that? And he said, well, you have to know your subject so well. And so my excuse for painting them that don't look like icons, they look like real people, is firstly, I can't paint what I can't see. And my other is more important, I'm fearful of them looking like a caricature if I try to do that. Now, there's Robert Letts in America, who's a brother who paints icons. He's very daring, he does some wonderful stuff, and he does change the faces. And you can say, oh yes, that is iconographic, and yes, I can recognise that person. I'm not that confident to do that, but I'd still give them a halo. I think Calvin and Knox and Luther are turning in their graves because I've given them halos.
Were a lot of icons lost during the Russian Revolution?
Yes.
And
yes.
did some of them make their way into people's homes and they were rescued?
Look, it is said that their babushka, their grandmothers of Russia, kept the faith alive.
Yeah.
And it is alive. When we visited that cathedral, in the lower church, there's a baptistry in the side aisle. A walk-in baptistry like you'll find in a Baptist or a Churches of Christ church. And I didn't have time to photograph it because there were people gathering for their baptism lessons. So this group of adults, about 20 people, were gathered around the baptistry, having instruction in Christianity, being ready for their baptism the next Easter. It's wonderful. It's very exciting. A lot of icons were brought out of Russia by the Jews. So a lot of them are in Jerusalem.
There will be opportunity to talk further with Peter while we have tea and coffee, but perhaps we'll bring this stage to an end, and I'll ask Pastor Annette Buckley if she would express thanks on behalf of all of us for this wonderful afternoon we've had.
Darcy, yes, thank you very much, Peter. It's a subject that I don't think many of us know very much about. So to hear your passion and to see examples of work this afternoon has been really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions afterwards from people. I think for me one of the things was something you said near the very start, that with your Protestant background and your grandfather, that still for some reason you picked up that book, and you don't necessarily even know what it was that led you to that. And that's just so inspiring, that those sort of movements of the Spirit in us in ways that we might never imagine can lead to such richness in our life if we just attend to them and then follow where that's leading. So thank you for following that leading of the Spirit in your life, which has obviously enriched us this afternoon and so many people in the Icon School as well. Thank you for your time with us, and look forward to catching up and asking more questions and seeing these beautiful icons this afternoon. Thank you.
Peter, you have opportunity, of course, to look more closely at these icons. Some of them were projected on the wall, but others were not. So you can have a closer look.
So we're painting with yellow ochre and water, and then adding the egg tempera to firm it up a bit more. We can starting to refine it using a number 3 Kolinsky brush. Then adding a tiny bit of Mars black to make it even more refined. And we'll be using that also to put in the shading. Now that shading is in burnt umber. Now the two garments blocking it in, but we still see the shading coming underneath it. The green is terra vert, the orange is Mars orange, and the tail is going to be white, but we're using titanium grey as the base colour, so that will form the shadows. We've added titanium white for the highlighting, adding it to each of the base colours and adding it progressively more as we want more highlight. Using straight titanium white, we're putting it on in thin coats so that you can still see the grey underneath until the final highlights. The flesh tones are yellow, golden ochre and Ercolano red, a bit of terra vert, and the highlights adding to that are again the titanium white, and added progressively. And then the main features put in burnt umber. Burnt umber's going on the beard before the white, and build that up progressively to make a nice bushy white beard. And then also some Ercolano red in the for blushes, and then a yellow and titanium white background put on with a wide brush, a red Ercolano red halo and inscription.